Welcome to Better Health Guy Blogcasts, empowering your better health. And now, here's Scott, your Better Health Guy. The content of this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or medical condition. Nothing in today's discussion is meant to serve as medical advice or as information to facilitate self-treatment. As always, please discuss any potential health-related decisions with your own personal medical authority.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 212 of the Better Health Guy blogcast series. Today's guest is Nathalie Niddam, and the topic of the show is peptide bioregulators. Nathalie Niddam is a holistic nutritionist and longevity educator and is a trailblazer in the sphere of longevity and health span, focusing on strategies that range from health tech to ancestral health to resilience training. Nathalie is dedicated to helping us all live joyful and vibrant lives well into our 50s, 60s, and beyond. As the host of the Longevity Podcast with Nathalie Niddam, Nathalie is not just exploring new horizons, she's reshaping them. Her show is a guidepost for those who want to enhance the quality of their lives and extend their vitality well into their later years. Nathalie has deep expertise in bioregulator peptides, which are leading-edge compounds with the power to awaken the body's innate rejuvenation systems. This groundbreaking field is a cornerstone of her approach, as science and holistic care can and do come together to create real, meaningful results. And now my interview with Nathalie Niddam. I am beyond thrilled and sort of fanboying to have Nat Niddam here with us to talk about peptide bioregulators. And I was introduced to her work several months ago through a mutual follower. And I have to say, I am loving her work. I'm loving her podcast. I'm so honored to have her here with us today. We're going to talk about peptide bioregulators, which have been used by more than 15 million people, as I understand, and many top practitioners are finding these to have very significant benefits in their health supporting toolbox. Thanks for being here today, Nat.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. It's a pleasure. And I've heard about you through the grapevine for years and years. So I'm thrilled to finally get to meet the Better Health Guy.
So what led you to really being the force that you are today? Did you have your own personal health journey that kind of fueled your passion for what I would call curiosity and also for finding solutions to really improve both your health, but then improve the broader health of so many others as well?
I mean, yes and no, right? And I yes and no, because I think that my health journey it's not unusual. It's not overly, well, it's dramatic at times, but it's not overly dramatic. And I think that the points of drama that happened in my journey were driven by underlying things that I was not aware of or I hadn't identified as an issue. But I would say that what really fueled my journey is I've always been interested in science and the human body and in health. And I studied physiology when I was in university, and I got fairly waylaid as an adult and ended up in the corporate space for most of my adult life. But I was always a fitness instructor. So I always kind of kept like a little baby toe in this space of helping people and kind of in the health space. And then what happened was one morning I woke up and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And I had a conversation with my chiropractor, to whom I'd been downloading a whole bunch of information on new things I was learning at the time. It was about the paleo diet and the bulletproof diet and all this stuff. And he was downloading it to his patients. And he came back to me and he said, you know what, Nat, like you could move the needle for people. Like you should do something with this. And within a week, I'd gone back to school to become a holistic nutritionist. And, food for me has always been a thing. And so it was kind of like my gateway into the space, if you will. And as far as my personal health journey goes, I would say, if looking back now, right, I can go back and say, well, I was born by C-section. I probably had, I don't know, pick a number, 10, 15 courses of antibiotics when I was a small child. My microbiome was a disaster. As a little kid, I was overweight, and probably because my microbiome had been nuked before the age of 2. Like I'd had pneumonia, I'd had whooping cough, I'd had all these different things. when there was a summer when I was about, I'm going to say maybe 10 or 11 years old, where I think I got strep throat 4 times in a row. And so, being a teenager, I had major microbiome issues. I had major candida overgrowth that was, not diagnosed, that I think affected my ability even to function at a higher level in school, so that, I went from being a really smart kid to thinking that I had a leak in my brain. Like literally. And again, so I go through my adult life and, I'm dealing with some gut issues, and I'm dealing with, kind of weight that I was never really fully happy with my body composition, even though I was a fitness instructor. And then as a very generally healthy person, these weird things would happen, right? Like I would have crazy allergic reactions to random things. Like I used to love pistachio nuts. And one day I'm teaching a fitness class, and, my face is kind of itchy, and I look in the mirror and half my face is like disappeared in swelling. I look like Martin Short in that movie when he gets stung by a bee. And so I drive myself to the hospital, and I ended up putting two and two together. And it turns out that I'd had this pistachio allergy that had kind of been building and building and building. And it only seemed to get triggered when I ate pistachios and exercised. It was the weirdest thing, right? So with that histamine release would get exacerbated by the fitness, by working out. And, the doctor who saw me said, so if I was you, I'd probably stay away from pistachio nuts because you're kind of on the road to anaphylaxis. So probably this is not your food. And I'm like looking at my face going, yeah, probably it's not. I'm on board. I love pistachios, but pretty sure I can live without them. So that was one. And then I had another event where I was using topical NSAIDs for a knee problem, and inside of a week or two, my knee started to turn red. Then I go see my friend at his house. He's drawing lines on my leg with a pen, which is never a good sign. If a doctor ever starts coloring on you, bad sign. And by the next morning, I'm in the hospital and I've developed cellulitis. And I had this major allergic reaction to the topical NSAIDs. My leg looked like somebody had poured boiling water on it. It was wild. Why? Like I never thought it would look normal. Anyway, and then the next most dramatic event would be when I had my son and I developed preeclampsia. And so, so I have this life of being mostly healthy all the time, but then these crazy weirdo events of an immune system that's mostly okay, but every once in a while when it goes rogue, goes like major rogue.
It's interesting because the overlap, I was also in the corporate world and then shifted into this realm about 8 years ago. And thank goodness I did. I haven't looked back. But similar kind of story with the microbiome. I was breastfed for 2 weeks. I had many antibiotics for ear infections when I was young. And then I got Lyme disease and was on antibiotics daily for 4 years. So I think a lot of people listening, and we don't need to go too deeply into it because I really want to focus on the bioregulators, but trying to restore the microbiome after having had so many insults is something that I personally am still working on and haven't found any real magic. So I'm wondering what were the biggest things for you in kind of bringing regulation and balance back to your microbiome?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a lifelong endeavor. It is absolutely like, I don't think that my microbiome problems are solved. I think that there's times when it's better and times when it's worse. I would say that overall, even though there have been times where I've tried a new probiotic, let's say, and it's been like, oh, this is really good for a couple of weeks or even a month. And then all of a sudden it stops working. And you're like, well, what the heck? And what I have found is, first of all, supporting my digestion has been critical. The supplements that you would have to pry out of my dying hands would be my ox bile, my tudica, and my liver support. Like you would literally, that makes more of a difference to me because as a result of my microbiome imbalances, I dealt with chronic constipation my entire life that I didn't even really realize what it was until later when I actually started paying attention to these things. And so, which in and of itself creates other problems. I only figured out, I want to say 3 months ago, that I probably was bitten by a tick when I was a kid because it put me in the hospital for a week and nobody could figure out what was wrong with me. And I'm the one who finally put two and two together recently and went, oh, wait, you mean I ended up in the hospital with swollen joints and all these crazy symptoms and nobody could figure out what it was? But, when I was camping. Wait. Never mind a smoking gun. Like, I mean, anyway, be that as it may, we're not going to dwell on that. To answer your question, it's been a combination of proper diet, a few key supplements but not just only looking down at the microbiome, looking at the whole digestion process. Because the microbiome is a piece of the puzzle, but at the end of the day, I think that if your microbiome is disrupted enough, it affects everything. The whole GI system gets affected. So you can't just say, oh, well, if I recreate the perfect garden in my gut, everything else is going to start working, because everything else has been affected your whole life, right? So it is an ongoing journey. And, you learn a little more every year. You learn that your body changes and therefore your needs change. And as a woman, the hormonal changes I went through at menopause were also very much kind of pulled the rug out from under my feet and had to start all over again and go at it again. So I would say to the audience that it doesn't mean you can't rebuild a good microbiome. You can, but it's one of those things that it's not a one and done. There's not a final solution. You're going to have to pivot and you're going to have to adapt, because your body is constantly adapting to a changing world and a changing environment. So it's a process.
Totally agree. I'm also a fan of the Toro Urso deoxycholic acid that you are also, we're not going to pry out of your dying hands for sure.
No. Somebody said to me, you need to give up some supplements. I'm like, well, it ain't going to be those.
So talk to us a little bit about peptide bioregulators. Are they naturally occurring in the body? How are they different from peptides like BPC 157? Why are we able to use bioregulators in an oral format where peptides, generally speaking, are injectable or maybe nasal? Talk to us a little bit about the difference between peptide bioregulators and peptides.
Yeah. There's a few questions there. So if I forget one, you'll have to kind of remind me. So I talk about long chain peptides and peptide bioregulators, right? So the hallmark of the peptide bioregulator is that it is 2 to 4 amino acids long. Now there is some rumblings around that say maybe there's some bioregulators that are 5 amino acids long. Like, no, we're not fully. There's not full clarity on it, because like everything else, the science is not settled. The final word has not been spoken. It never will be, right? We know that Dr. Kavan-Zinn, who is the Russian physician who discovered and developed this whole space of bioregulator peptides, he made commercially available 21 bioregulators. We know that he had another 30 or so that he'd figured out that he never ended up releasing. And we have people now like Dr. Kent Holtorf, who you were talking about earlier, who's done some digging and who's like, wait, there's more going on here. And, it's really interesting to me that his ThyroPep supplement, which is thyroid bioregulators, well, if you look in the commercially available bioregulators, there are 5 that are not available as synthetics. And the thyroid is one of them. And I think that it's because there's not one sequence in that thyroid bioregulator cohort that could be identified as the one thing that's going to move the needle for sure, right? And we'll get into a bit more of that in a little while when we talk about the synthetic versus the natural. But the way to answer your question, I think, is to go back to when Kavan-Zinn first really was doing his work on and discoveries on bioregulators. And the way he kind of honed in on them originally is he saw that these little 2 to 4 amino acid sequences were naturally occurring in literally every single life form that he looked at. And in science, when scientists find something that Mother Nature has taken the trouble to preserve across all species, we're like, okay, this must be important. This is clearly something that's really, really important. And so however he put 1 and 1 together and 2 and 2 and took his next leaps, he then figured out that these sequences of amino acids, and they're not a straight line, they're organized in like different 3D shapes with different bonds and whatever, to the point where you can have 2 bioregulators that have the same 2 amino acids, but they're not arranged the same, so they act differently. And so he got into this world of figuring out that they are naturally occurring in our body. Like our bodies has respect, we live with them. This is how our body repairs in many ways, but they're also naturally occurring in foods. Now, the foods I would say that probably have the highest percentage of bioregulators would be organs. Animal organs, right? So, which is super interesting because when you look at the testimonials on a website for like ancestral supplements, there's a couple of companies out there that basically take animal organs and desiccate them, smush them up and throw them in a capsule. And you see these incredible stories of healing and incredible stories of transformation. And you think about what's living in that liver, what's living in the heart, what's living in the thyroid, what's living is a whole bunch of stuff, including those bioregulators, right? And so, in the hierarchy of bioregulator sources, if you will, I would say that that whole food source is going to be the least refined, but it's also going to bring with it a whole cohort of other compounds that work synergistically, right? So it's kind of like the difference between eating an orange and taking vitamin C.
So one of the things, as I understand, is that peptides like BPC 157, not necessarily organ specific, can have application in many parts of the body, but the bioregulators are, as I understand, very tissue, gland, or organ specific, right?
So yes and no. So that's a really interesting point. So for the BPC one, so one thing you asked was, before I talk about that, you asked about the difference between the bioregulators and the longer chain peptides. And I believe that the main difference is that the longer chain peptides act mostly on receptors on the outside of the cell, right? They affect the expression and healing cascades and whatnot by attaching to receptors and in turn affecting other receptors, right? The bioregulator, by definition, has the ability to get into the nucleus of the cell and act directly on the DNA. So that doesn't mean that BPC might not trigger certain expressions of certain genes, but it's going to do it in a different way through a different mechanism. We have peptides that kind of are straddling this line, right? Like GHK. Would GHK be a bioregulator if Cavinson had discovered it before Lauren Pickard? Probably. Right? The thing with GHK is it's so pleiotropic. It acts on so many different genes that it's almost hard to know, is it a skin bioregulator? Is it a repair bioregulator? Is it like it acts on the brain? It acts on the gut. Like it acts on many different pieces of the puzzle. It's virtually as pleiotropic as a BPC 157. And probably more so, right? Because it flips so, I think it's over 1,000. I always forget if it's 1,000 or 4,000 genes. Regardless, it's a heck of a lot of genes. It's busy. And we are born with a lot of it, and our levels decline dramatically as we age, right? So GHK is really interesting, and I would say I often refer to it as the orphan bioregulator. It got left out of the family just maybe because, it didn't get found by the right person at the right time. But having said that, I used to say, and I used to think that the pineal gland bioregulator acted on the pineal gland, the thyroid bioregulator acted on the thyroid, the heart bioregulator acted on the heart. And for the most part, I think that's true, except that the pineal gland bioregulator also acts on the thymus. And there also seems to act maybe on the heart, and it may act on different areas. In one of the books that I read, they talked about because very often what you'll see is that peptide bioregulators don't often get used by themselves, like in isolation. So when Cavinson speaks about using bioregulators, he's using at least 2 and often 3 at the same time. And in this book, one of the things that they talked about, and it was very brief and they didn't go through all of them, but it talked about how certain bioregulators, when they're administered together, it's almost like a tag team effect. One bioregulator gets the DNA helix to unwind so that the other bioregulator can find its spot and bind it. Like it's so cool, right? Like it's ridiculous. You're just sitting there going, oh my God, that is so cool. And it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, I'm a bit of a geek. And so to me, it's like awe-inspiring. I'm like, wow, it's so magnificent to witness how nature does these beautiful things, like the synergies that take place are just, they're kind of like amazing. Well, not kind of like, they are amazing. It is amazing when you really connect with the magic and the sophistication of this vessel that we are blessed to occupy in this life. And I would say that even those of us who are really sick, if you think about all of the incredible things that are happening in your body every second of every minute of every hour of every day, you would realize that there's so much more that works than that doesn't. Right? We often, when we're sick, and I mean, it's hard because when you're feeling like crap and you have no energy and you're achy and all these things, all we focus on is what's not working. But let's always take a minute, of every day to think about what is working, because there's so much that is working for us. It's just us finding the way to help to clear the way for more of that and less of the other stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Love that. So let's talk then a little bit about where the peptide bioregulator products come from. In other words, what are they derived from? Are they off the table for vegetarians and vegans? And then let's touch on the difference between natural and synthetic bioregulators. My understanding is that the Cavinson bioregulators are natural if we're talking about his line or the Nature's Marvels, but help us distinguish those.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the answer to are they off the table for vegans and vegetarians is it depends how rigid they are. If the reason for being a vegan or vegetarian is that you can't bear the thought of an animal having given its life for a product to be produced, then yeah, they're off the table, right? Because they are refined and they're extracted and refined from tissues, glands, and organs of either pigs or cows, sometimes sheep. So at that level, yes. If, however, the concern is for some reason exposure to animal proteins, right? There's literally no discernible animal protein left by the time the bioregulator has gone through the process of going from the organ to the capsule. So it depends on where you draw your lines, and it depends on why you are following this program. The synthetic bioregulator has never been a part of an animal. The synthetic bioregulator, basically what's happened is that the most active sequence of peptides, let's say in the pineal gland bioregulator, has been identified and isolated. And so it can now be synthesized in a lab and presented as an option to be used either as a subcutaneous injection. We're starting to see them now as intranasals. We're seeing them as sublinguals. We're seeing them as even in capsules, and we're even starting to see them delivered across the skin. So because they're so tiny, there's a plethora of methods of delivery. Now there's third form that not that many people are aware of. And this is one of the reasons why I think dosing got really messed up back in the day. And that is the third form is a form that Cavinson actually used in his studies when he did those studies in Russia. And that third form is an actual extract from the tissue or the gland that has been prepared as an intramuscular injection. And that would be, so now, and this is why, I mean, the nomenclature of bioregulators is enough to just drive you insane, right? So we have epithalamin, we have endolutin, and we have epitalon. All three are the pineal gland bioregulator, but they are completely different forms of the pineal gland bioregulator, and they are different dosing. So epithalamin, I believe, is 10 milligrams per dose. Endolutin they're 10 milligram capsules. Epitalon, we're talking about micrograms. We're talking about 100 micrograms up to 1 milligram. Now, until not that long ago, people were applying the 10 milligram dosing of the epithalamin and the endolutin to epitalon. So you had a bunch of people running around like, injecting themselves with 10 milligrams a day for 10 days, or I was one of them. Until Jean-François Tremblay came across a thread there where some Russian dude had taken the time to actually go back to the original paper and go, hold on, actually, we got it kind of wrong.
So endolutein is the Cavenson name for what we have in the Nature's Marvels as pineal, correct?
Correct. And then to make things worse, they called the central nervous system one pinealon. Like, really? Come on. It has the word pineal in it. Now, interestingly enough, it does act on the pineal gland as well, but it's primarily a central nervous system bioregulator.
And the brain, as I learned later. I'm like, why isn't there a brain bioregulator?
There is. It's the pinealon. Yeah. Which is seralutin. And but to answer your other question, I think you asked about the Nature's Marvels and the Cavenson. So Cavenson didn't give permission to too many people to produce bioregulators as he had envisioned them and created them and the whole nine yards. And he had very, very close relationship with Phil Mikens over Profound Health. And back in the day, they figured out that, you know what, when we're trying to deliver stuff across customs and whatnot, it actually is a lot easier to do that when there's not a whole bunch of scary Russian writing on the boxes, because the Weebles in the Weeble hut get pretty suspicious when they can't actually read the ingredients. So, and then they're likely to start asking questions and opening things and sending them back or throwing them away or whatever the case may be. So they decided to create and launch this Nature's Marvels brand. So it was, back in the day, the capsules that you got in Nature's Marvels boxes were the exact same as the ones that were in the Cavenson. Like, it was the same thing, just thrown into a different box. Fast forward to today, because of what's happened over the last couple of years, because of the Russian war, and it's been so hard, Russia-Ukraine war, it's been so hard to, number one, get anything out of Russia. Number two, if you could even get anything out of Russia, there was nowhere to pay them because none of the countries will allow it. Like, there's stories of people running around places around Russia with suitcases full of cash trying to pay people and not being able to do it. Like right out of a movie, right? So what Profound Health did is, with Dr. Cavenson's blessing, but not, he wasn't a partner with them or anything, they were able to develop their own line of bioregulators. So the animals are raised in the EU. I can't really say where. They're raised in the EU, and the bioregulators are formulated as per the directions, as per the methodology that Dr. Cavenson created. But what's really interesting is, in order to produce a product that is FDA compliant, they had to analyze exactly what was in those extracts. And it's been fascinating. I'm actually going to, I'm having Phil Mikens back on the podcast in the next little while. And what's fascinating and what they discovered is what everybody kind of suspected, but hadn't really been elucidated. And probably it's buried in some Russian paper somewhere that nobody's translated yet. But basically, and that is that the natural extract contains a whole cohort of other compounds. There are other peptides and bioregulators and amino acids that they all work together. And this is why when we talk about when we use the natural bioregulator, it's going to take a little longer to see effect, but the effect might last longer. Whereas when we're using the synthetic, you get a much cleaner hit, you get a faster effect. But in the Russian teachings, they would say, start with the synthetic to get your first bit of movement. But ideally, what you want to do is you want to follow it up with the naturals.
So it's kind of like taking an isolate from an herb versus using all of the phytochemicals that are in the actual herb itself. So the Cavenson Vita line and the Nature's Marvels line that you just talked to us about, have you seen any clinical differences in how people respond to them? None.
None. I mean, Bill Lawrence uses Nature's Marvels almost exclusively, right? There was a point in time where he had to find what he could find because he couldn't get it. Like they were out of stock for so long. But we haven't seen any clinical difference. I would say the only difference now is that we have far greater transparency in terms of what's in the Nature's Marvels capsule versus what's in the Russian product, because, they don't always think that we need to know everything.
So these peptide bioregulators, they have this ability to kind of initiate protein synthesis. Wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about what they physiologically are doing in the body, and is each of the different bioregulators, the organ, gland, tissue specific bioregulators, like maybe liver and kidney, is it essentially having the same bioregulation effect, but on that specific gland, for example, or are the properties of each bioregulator different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that I can give you the best answer here. All I know is that in the case of the kidney, the bioregulator is going to act on the DNA in the kidney and upregulate either, and it's an interesting nuance that I think we're gonna maybe hopefully get more clarity on as we go. Is it repairing the DNA's ability to do what it was doing to begin with, or is it just pushing the DNA to produce proteins? But the net result is that you're getting a regeneration and a restoration of function to some degree at a cellular level of that gland or tissue or organ.
So if we think a little bit about this epigenetic influence that the bioregulators have, you mentioned earlier, I believe somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 genes in one scenario that potentially are impacted. Is that change in genetic expression specific to the kidney, for example, if you're using the kidney bioregulator, or is it changing more systemic genetic expression throughout the entire body?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the case of GHK, that's the one that acts on whether it's 1,000 or 4,000 genes, I think you're going to see a much broader effect. Right? And like, for example, with GHK, you're seeing an upregulation in the production of collagen and elastin. Well, you would be hard pressed to say that that's only going to affect skin, because collagen and elastin is involved in every organ that has to contract and relax. That means blood vessels, the heart, the kidneys, the lungs, like the all of them, right? Collagen and elastin is also integral to bone quality. So in that sense, it's most likely to be a systemic effect. It's going to act on different systems in this upregulation. For the kidney bioregulator, it'll probably be much more specific to the kidney because it's specific to the function of that organ. Same with the pancreas. In the case of the pancreas, there's some literature that implies that, they've even seen some restoration of some of the function of the cells in the pancreas, the islet cells that produce insulin. Now, have I seen someone with type 1 diabetes reverse their type 1 diabetes? Nope. But do I have people in my community who say that they feel that their blood sugar regulation has become better after a few months of a few cycles of the pancreas bioregulator? Yes. Now, are they also working on their diet and working out and doing all the things? 100%. But from an assistive perspective, the bioregulator seems to be helping to bring balance back into that organ.
You mentioned Bill Lawrence, who you've had some great episodes on your podcast. And one of them, you were talking about aging and eventual disease states really being kind of centrally tied to failure of the cellular DNA repair mechanisms. And each time a cell replicates, and as we get older, there's more potential for errors or mistakes in that process. So where do these bioregulators potentially come into the cellular DNA repair mechanism conversation? And is the goal of using peptide bioregulators to increase lifespan, health span, or both?
So the answer to the last question is both. Right. The answer to the first question, and that is what's interesting, I think, about Bill's work, as he's been working with these extensively now for, I think, almost a decade. And that is that he believes that what the bioregulator is doing is restoring function, like it's restoring the DNA to the ability to function the way it should be. Like, notice that as children, we heal faster. Kids self-repair unless there's something dramatically wrong with them. They seem to kind of repair on the fly. And then as we get older and older and older, and the insults increase, and the toxic load increases, and whatever we're dealing with, gets thrown into the bucket, that system of self-rejuvenation and repair starts to decline. Right? So is it possible that the bioregulators can help to restore some of that? I think it is. Is it going to help us be our peptide bioregulator is going to make us immortal? Hell no. They're just not that strong. And there's a lot more at play.
There is some discussion about peptide bioregulators and reversing or reducing biological age. You've talked about different methods for testing that. I was kind of interested if we're looking at telomere length, for example, that's usually not being tested specific to the kidneys or the liver or the brain. It's usually a blood test or maybe a saliva test or something along those lines. So do you think that that type of testing is really giving us an accurate representation of the potential for peptide bioregulators to help with biological age reduction?
So again, your questions were really good. So I think that on the telomere front, we know that the pineal gland bioregulator activates telomerase. So that is the enzyme that maintains and restores the integrity of the telomeres on the ends of the DNA. And this is where the pineal gland bioregulator, interestingly, from the pineal gland is directing something. And it's having a systemic effect, right? Because it's not only affecting the telomeres of the pineal gland, it's having a systemic effect on telomerase that would affect the telomeres. There's two different main methodologies that I'm aware of right now to test telomere length. You've got true diagnostic, and then you've got SpectraCell. Now, SpectraCell actually measures the length of telomeres. True diagnostic does not. They kind of present some kind of an average. And I know that Bill in his work, because he's doing these studies with people, he's doing clinical research with people, he prefers the SpectraCell test over the true diagnostic test for measuring telomeres because they're actually measuring telomeres. Like they're actually sitting there and counting the little base pairs, right? So from a telomere perspective, he would skew to SpectraCell. What I would say to people is pick a team and just stick with it. If you're going to use true diagnostic, because I don't even believe that we have full clarity on what we're actually measuring here. I think the testing still has a ways to go.
And wouldn't it be possible that the length of the telomeres in a specific organ, gland, or tissue where we're using a peptide bioregulator is different from what we would get with maybe a blood or saliva sample, which is more systemic?
Sure. Yeah, like I think the science is we still have to it still needs to be elucidated and teased out. Now you've got True Diagnostic that now has their Harmony age, I think that's what it's called, where they are actually looking at DNA methylation system by system. They're looking at the brain. They're looking at different organs. Again, it's very new, right? So it still remains to be seen. Okay, so I mean, I have a client I'm writing a bioregulator program for right now, and she showed up with her True Diagnostic organ by organ report and said, okay, let's fix this. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll try. I don't know that for sure we can. It's interesting information. So let's see what happens when we focus here, there, or the other place. And we don't really know how long it's going to take either.
So given that these bioregulators, as I understand, are absorbed in the small intestine, how important is optimizing intestinal health before we start working with them? If we're dealing with something like SIBO or SIFO, should we address that first? And then extending on that, are peptide bioregulators these magic pills, or do we still need a healthy foundation, diet, sleep, managing stress? I know you have the Nat Niddam nutrition prep for bioregulators. Talk to us about the need for setting the foundation for optimizing bioregulator function.
Yeah. So number one, I think that they don't need an optimized because they're so small. Because Kavinson talks about there are actual transporters for these guys. And frankly, if gut health is really a concern, then maybe what we do is we look at some of the other delivery mechanisms, right? Maybe we look to the synthetic bioregulators. And even though they're not, I think that the natural bioregulators are superior in many ways to the synthetics for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. But maybe for that time, you use the synthetic. And as you're resolving your gut issues, you move to the natural. But and this is not scientific. I just don't believe that they wouldn't be absorbed because you don't need to digest them. There's no necessity for a protease to cleave protein. Like the work's been done, right? So this is what's interesting. if your digestive enzymes are completely whacked, your body's not going to be able to break down your proteins into those segments. And the reason why, actually, you had asked this earlier, and I don't think I answered it. The reason why they're bioavailable orally is because the way that Cavinson explains it is, your body doesn't just produce enzymes that chop up proteins into single amino acids. There's actually cleavage sites at different places on different proteins so that the body is breaking them up into recognizable functional chunks. And those bioregulators are identified as functional chunks by the terminal, by the bonds and the whatever's, by the identifiers that determine where the protein's going to get broken down. So in the case of the bioregulators, you're already delivering it to the body prepped. It's ready to be absorbed. It doesn't need to be digested. So that's why I think that even if your gut is not optimized, you're still going to get really good results. But again, because that's not a scientific answer.
It's a Nat Niddam answer, which is meets the mustard for me. So how about the lifestyle piece, the sleep piece? And then I remember some conversation that some people using bioregulators did not see improvement in biological age. And if I remember correctly, that was getting more into kind of the realm of stress management and stress hormone chemistry and those kinds of things.
Yeah, 100%. So first of all, yes, if you're under chronic stress and your body is in a constant state of fight and flight, and you're in this catabolic disaster state where your cortisol's sky high and your blood sugar is not where it needs, like all the things. I mean, you're probably better off with the bioregulators than without, but are you going to get optimal results? No. Right. And that extends to everything else. You want to be working on all the other pieces of the puzzle. There is no silver bullet here. The bioregulators will work towards bringing balance back to the system. And I think you have another question about this later, so I'm not going to go ahead. But the bioregulator will do what it can. But if if the house is on fire, the house is still on fire. So you could throw a new cabinet in the kitchen, it's going to get burnt down again. So you need to get the fire under control so that the contractor can do the work and the work can live to see another day.
You saying there is no silver bullet here kind of brought me back to your podcast when you say no medical advice is given here.
Yeah.
So let's talk then about maybe the stack. You talked about using stacks of bioregulators. I think one of the more common ones is pineal, thymus, and blood vessel. So supporting the hormonal, the sleep side of things, the immune system, circulation, all of those foundational aspects of health. And I'd be interested in your thoughts about the pineal bioregulator. Is that primarily supporting sleep? You've already talked about it having some effect on downstream hormone production. The thymus bioregulator, is that more immune boosting or immune modulatory? And then in the day that we're living in now with COVID and all of the endotheliitis and coagulation and those types of things, I think blood vessel health is so critical for essentially everyone. So where does that come into play?
Yeah, I think, you hit it. The pineal gland bioregulator has very far-reaching effects, right? The pineal gland from sitting at the top of the chain here, it has a balancing effect on the entire endocrine system. So right out of the gate, it's not going to be dramatic. It's not like, you're in a hormone chaos, you take your pineal gland bioregulator and everybody falls into line. But overall, it does what it can to exercise a balancing effect on the endocrine system. In addition, it normalizes melatonin levels. And so when we do that, not only does sleep get better, but melatonin is the most important antioxidant in our body. So there's a whole lot of other stuff that's going to happen there. It's going to help to regulate circadian rhythm. As long as you're not hanging out in a casino every night until 4 o'clock in the morning, popping your Epidolon when you go home, guess what? Not going to help. Right? And then there's that telomerase thing. And then there's the fact that Epidolon also has effects on a broad sense on the immune system. But notice the language, right? Epidolon was shown to normalize melatonin levels, particularly in elderly adults. right? Now, it can normalize melatonin levels in younger adults where melatonin levels are dysregulated, which frankly, I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone these days who doesn't have dysregulated melatonin levels because they're staring at their screens and they're not getting outside and their life, like all the many, many reasons. The thymus gland bioregulator 100% is going to be balancing and modulating to the immune system. Whereas thymosin alpha 1, which is a longer chain bioregulator, which I know that the in the chronic illness community, thymosin alpha 1 is a very important peptide. But don't forget, guys, that it cranks up the Th1, the innate immune system. If your innate immune system's already overperforming, you're just going to exacerbate it with Ta1. The thymus gland bioregulator over time potentially can help to balance things out a little bit. So it's the reason why, and I mean, the most powerful example of this is with the thyroid bioregulator, in that that thyroid bioregulator can be used by someone who's either hyper or hypothyroid, and it will bring balance back to both. And you can't do that even with like desiccated thyroid or glandular thyroid.
So would you say that the thymus bioregulator would generally be okay for people that have autoimmunity?
Generally, yes. The thing is, like, I never say always, and I never say never. And I think that there are people whose systems have become so sensitive that they can react to these things. So in their case, I would say start with, if the dose is 2 capsules, start with 1. Maybe start with a half, right? Maybe you need to start with like a tiny amount because it's too much stimulation for your body, for your system.
So let's touch then on the coagulation issues, the blood vessel bioregulator. Is that something that potentially can help improve nutrient delivery in the body, maybe even waste removal in the body? How is that supporting optimal health?
Yeah, so the blood vessel bioregulator is foundational, and you're going to find it pop up in protocols all over the place for that very reason. Because it acts beneficially on the endothelium of blood vessels, it's going to be, and from a macro circulation right down to the most micro circulation, you're going to see a benefit for all of those things that you just mentioned. Is it enough to repair damage from, whether it's a spike protein or a lifetime of smoking and drinking and eating the wrong foods and the whole 9 yards? Not unless you're doing everything else. Right? When I interviewed Bill, I don't know if it was the last time I interviewed him or the time before, but he was in touch with all these doctors who were coming up with these very thorough protocols to try and rid the body of the spike protein. And yeah, bioregulators are great, but at some level you need the nattokinase and the serrapeptase and so you still have to do all the other things, which actually brings me to another point about the bioregulators, that a lot of the research that Cavinson did would look at what happens if somebody, let's say, has COPD and we just give them the drugs. But what happens if we give them the drugs and the bioregulator? And it turns out that the bioregulators play just fine with medicine. Now, again, I'm not saying always and all the time and in every case, because I can't tell you that. I don't have universal knowledge. But in general terms, they would very often use the bioregulators alongside conventional medications and find that people got better results faster.
Yeah, I'm currently doing the blood vessel and retina bioregulators, so
Nice.
I'm excited to see if I notice anything from that. You mentioned the pineal bioregulator. You've mentioned, I think you said epidolon. I don't ever know really how to announce it. I've always said epitalin.
Me too.
Who knows? So do we think the pineal bioregulator has a similar potential to affect change in the body as maybe using injectable epidolon or epitalin, or would we say that it's significantly less strong?
Injectable epidolon versus the oral natural bioregulator. I don't think it's a better or worse. I think it's a different. I mean, it's the same type of effect. And I know that Bill does not love the synthetic bioregulators. He feels that Cavinson did way more research on the natural and didn't use the synthetic quite as much. And I completely get where he's coming from. And for that reason, he really sticks pretty closely to the natural bioregulators. But I do think there's a place for the synthetics, both for people who won't use animal products and also for people who are extremely sensitive, because it allows us not only to titrate the dose much more finely, but it's also, there's less of a global effect on the gland, right? So it's a much more precise effect.
One of the biggest contributors, in my opinion, to many chronic illnesses is the exposure that we have to environmental toxicants of many kinds, pesticides, chemicals, heavy metals, all of that. It's really amazing that any of us can thrive in the world that we've created. So the kidney bioregulator was the first one that I started with. I had some kidney stress after a heavy metal chelation or detoxification type protocol. I know there's the liver one as well. So are we thinking the kidney and liver bioregulators are potentially optimizing detoxification potential, or are we thinking of them for other reasons like maybe chronic kidney disease or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or potentially a combination of both if we're regenerating the liver and the kidneys?
Yeah, I think the answer was C, is both to some degree. And so what I have seen is I've seen people who were struggling with liver enzymes do a few rounds of the liver bioregulator and see their liver enzymes normalize. I've seen, with the kidney, it's tricky, right? What's tricky about the kidney is, there's a doctor who lives in Hawaii. Her name is Dr. Robin Rose, and she's taken like the deep dives of all deep dives into bioregulators to the point where she's got a book coming out. But her main interest is chronic kidney disease, CKD. And her book is about CKD, but her book is written for the physician. It's a sophisticated read, but she created a materia medica at the back of the book of the bioregulators. It's really impressive. And she would say, with the kidneys, the problem with kidneys is we're in an epidemic of CKD right now because conventional medicine doesn't acknowledge CKD until people have pretty much fallen off the cliff. I think it's even worse than with type 2 diabetes. There's an acceptance, if you will, of underperforming kidney function until it's really bad. Right. So I think that the kidney bioregulator probably could be helpful, but you have to think about why, is blood pressure an issue? Do the blood vessels need help? I just came across yet another thing recently. Like I've always thought for cardiovascular, I hadn't read this anywhere. For me, the cardiovascular system, we're going to work on the heart, the blood vessel, and the kidneys because the kidneys are part of that system. And I hadn't read it anywhere else. And finally today I came across something that was like, oh yeah, the heart, the blood vessel, and the kidney. Like it makes sense. But what's really good for kidneys also in the peptide world is BPC 157. Because one of the things that a lot of people forget about BPC, it's body protective compound. One of the things that's encompassed in that is organoprotective. It protects organs. It protects the pancreas, it protects the liver, and it protects the kidney. And Jean-François Tremblay, way back, had told me a story about a good friend of his who had been diagnosed with chronic kidney disease and went off doing like blinding doses of BPC 157 and 3 months later had basically reversed his kidney disease. Right? Now that's an N of 1 anecdote. I don't have a study to back it up, but how interesting is that?
There are several bioregulators kind of in the hormone realm, thyroid, adrenal, ovaries, testes, those types of bioregulators. Many of our listeners are dealing with mast cell activation syndrome. Maybe they are being triggered by infections or toxins or limbic system impairment. You talked earlier a little bit about your reactions to certain things with histamine that could maybe also kind of fall into that mast cell realm. So do we find that the bioregulators are well tolerated in the more sensitive patient community? Can they be too much for some people? And then in the peptide world with mast cell activation, we would kind of think about BPC or KPV or amlexanox. Are there any bioregulators that have been helpful in kind of modulating that mast cell response?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would say that for me, I've had no issues with bioregulators. And have I seen people who are so sensitive that the bioregulator throws them into a tailspin? Not often, but yes. Right. So there's always going to be that person who's in such an elevated state of whose immune system is in such an elevated state of vigilance that anything is going to trigger it to respond. So know yourself. If you're hyper responsive to things, then start with a microdose and titrate up as slowly as possible. And the good news is you're good at checking in with yourself. Like people usually who are hypersensitive like that are acutely aware of their response to different things. And if you think that you're having a negative response, obviously stop immediately, let yourself come back to baseline, and then try one if you feel that it's possible that it was something else, because sensitive people respond to all kinds of things in their environment. So it may or may not have been the bioregulator. So if you're open to it and on an intuitive level, you feel that there's a possibility it was something else, you can try it again at the lowest dose and see how you do.
And would we think that there could be some potential for the thymus bioregulator, given that it's more immunomodulatory, to kind of help calm things in people that are dealing with mast cell activation syndrome?
Yeah, potentially. I think KPV is probably your best bet. KPV, interestingly enough, is a 3 amino acid peptide, and it's a fragment, right, of the melanotan peptide. But KPV is so interesting because it helps to stabilize mast cells. Are you also going to want to be doing your plasmalogens to help stabilize the cell membrane? Are you going to be wanting to do your phospholipids to help stabilize that cell membrane? Like, you're going to, it's the bioregulators end. I'll give you another analogy that I think can be helpful for people. Having a bioregulator is having a very, very skilled craftsman. But if all he has are tools and he doesn't have materials, he can't fix it, right? So if your body is getting the signal to upregulate proteins, but it's deficient in the materials that it needs, or the cell membrane is a hot mess, you're not going to get the full benefit of what you're asking for.
KPV being 3 amino acids, it technically then is also in the bioregulator realm, correct?
Well, I don't know. I think that what would really put it in the bioregulator realm is if it's acting on DNA. It's not just the size of the peptide, right? It's also where's it ending up and how's it doing what it does. And I don't know enough about, because I know the KPV has antimicrobial activity. Like it's a very, very interesting itty bitty little teeny tiny compound. Like it is shocking.
We alluded to this a little bit earlier, but more and more over the last several years, I see so many people struggling with collagen disorders, hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, BPC, I think can be helpful in that realm. I've heard you mention in other conversations the cartilage bioregulator as well. I'm guessing you're also going to say GHK copper potentially has a role. What would you be thinking of for people dealing with hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome?
Exactly those three. I mean, for sure. And, and of course, like maybe the bone marrow bioregulator might be helpful. Maybe, I would throw in the central nervous system. I always going to throw in some pineal gland in there, and I'm definitely going to throw in some blood vessel. It's not the body doesn't work in silos.
It's like you're making a beautiful salad.
A salad, an orchestra, a symphony, like whatever works for you, right? But at some level we have to think, but definitely in the EDS community, I remember way, way back at the beginning when I first started the Facebook group, there was a group of people with EDS who got their hands on GHK copper and were using it like a lot, right? They were injecting multiple times a day. They were using the GHK with the copper. And 6 months in, I get a note from one of them saying, you know what, I think some of us are starting to see copper toxicity issues. So you have to be mindful. The cool thing about GHK is if you have copper systemically available, bioavailable copper, you could probably just use GHK without the copper at least some of the time, right? Where it's important to use the copper is when we're using it topically on the skin, because it's not going to have access to the copper that's inside your system.
So you're saying there's a GHK that is not GHKCU?
It just doesn't have the Cu. So the Cu is required, the Cu, which is the copper, for people who don't know the chemical symbol, the copper is required as an active, like kind of a cofactor. Like it's required to activate the GHK. And that may be the wrong term, so forgive me. But regardless, in order for the GHK to do its thing, it needs copper, almost like a spark plug. But if you have adequate amounts of copper in your system, the GHK will most likely be able to avail itself of that copper to do the work.
The central nervous system bioregulator is essentially, the way I read it, kind of the brain bioregulator. It seems like it could have some application for people dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome, maybe MS, maybe Parkinson's, maybe Alzheimer's. Wondering what you've seen with the CNS bioregulator, how it might help people dealing with cognitive issues, even with brain fog, and then maybe touching on the cognitive stack of blood vessel, pineal, and central nervous system.
Yeah, so I know that there's a woman in my community who was trying to help her mom, who was really having major issues. And she felt that the central nervous system bioregulator was helping her mother. There's definitely, there's some literature that speaks to that about the CNS. You would definitely want to partner it with the blood vessel bioregulator, because we always want to ask, what are the other issues that might be affecting this condition? And cerebral blood flow is a major issue, right? So this is why, for me, the central nervous system bioregulator, yes. The pineal gland bioregulator, probably at least some of the time. The blood vessel bioregulator, 100%. The heart, yes. The kidneys, for sure. But also things like kudzu bands are phenomenal for restoring circulation systemically, including to the brain. Right? So let's not forget the whole other constellation of strategies. The plasmalogens are going to be critical for any of these people dealing with these issues, because we're also wanting to rebuild myelin sheath, right? But we also want to understand, for example, I remember interviewing a woman years ago about ALS, and she was finding that so many of her ALS patients actually had really severe issues with heavy metal toxicity. And in one particularly dramatic case, the man had been given a death sentence. He'd been told he had ALS to get his affairs in order. She got her hands on him. He came to see her with the clinic. They worked with him. They did heavy metal detoxes. They did the whole 9 yards. And lo and behold, he was running a marathon the next year. He didn't have ALS. He presented as someone who had ALS, but he had massive heavy metal toxicity. And they kind of figured it out because they went through his history that she spends 2 hours getting from people, and realized that he'd been exposed through a job years and years and years prior to heavy amounts of metals. So, I think that, don't forget that if you're loaded up with heavy metals, your system can't function, even with all the best supplements and bioregulators and peptides on the planet. We need to really take the time to gain some kind of understanding about what's the driver here, right? In Alzheimer's, is it an energy problem in this case? Because I believe that Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, from all the people I've interviewed, again, Alzheimer's is not a thing. It's a constellation of symptoms that have been, but you're going to see different ones in different people. So you're going to have different solutions, which is why, that medication that they approved recently, against the best advice of many of the top researchers in the space, is so controversial, because those tau proteins have sequestered toxins. So if you're going to break them down and release the hounds, you better have somebody around to round them up.
Yeah, same idea with biofilms, right? The idea of coming in with biofilm breakers when you have Lyme and metals and mold and all of those things can be significantly making people feel worse and more dysregulated. I love the plasmalogens as well. I think we've both had Dr. Dan Goodenow on our podcast, so please go listen to those. And I do find, and this is my lens, but I do find a lot of these conditions as well, that there is a mold and mycotoxin component, that there is a Lyme and and vector-borne infection component. So to your point, a lot of times we need to look more at the root causes and not just accept the labels that we're being given. I wonder with the CNS bioregulator, have you observed that it has any impact on the autonomic nervous system if people are dealing with dysautonomia or POTS, or would you maybe be thinking more the blood vessel bioregulator?
That's a good question. I don't have personal experience in that area. I would say that if I was dealing with it, I would certainly give it a try, right? I would certainly go at it with the CNS and the blood vessel. And I think we see POTS also in the EDS community, right? So there's a tone issue. So are we going to throw in the cartilage bioregulator to try and see, can we upregulate the production of collagen and elastin? Could GHK also be a factor here? So it's always like, what are the other pieces that we can bring into the puzzle that might help the system?
That's a very good reminder that it doesn't have to be one or the other, but we can have both peptide bioregulators. There is a conversation around the metabolic stack with blood vessel, liver, and pancreas. I'm interested in why thyroid wasn't part of the metabolic stack. And do you see people able to bring balance to their glucose and insulin modulation, improvements with metabolic syndrome, maybe the pancreas bioregulator as well? How are you thinking about metabolic syndrome from a perspective of bioregulators?
Yeah, I mean, listen, when I put out that metabolic stack, it was like it was a very simple way to look at it. But of course, if thyroid is involved, you got to throw thyroid in there, right? Even stomach. I find stomach sometimes I have to remind myself, well, wait, what about the stomach, dude? Like nobody's making enough digestive enzymes anymore. Nobody's making hydrochloric acid anymore. We got to cycle that in. And you had actually asked in the notes that you'd sent me, you'd asked about the parathyroid bioregulator. That's like, if GHK is the orphan, parathyroid is like the kid that nobody ever pays attention to. And the parathyroid is wildly important in things when we're thinking about osteoporosis, when we're thinking about mineral balance, right? So for me, for example, for metabolic, it could be a whole, like metabolic syndrome also is cardiovascular. Also, it's blood pressure. So, once we get to the world where you're like, okay, Nat, I can think of 7 bioregulators that are involved here. So now we're going to split them up into groups because I'm not a lover of people taking more than 3 or 4 at a time. I know that there's literature that says they can take up to 5, but I feel like people start to max out after a while. That's like 10 capsules a day at 5. And then you've got all the other stuff that you're taking. It's a lot, right? This is a long game. Don't forget, nothing's going to change overnight. You didn't get here overnight. So the other thing is that I think the importance of pulsing the bioregulators gets overlooked by a lot of people because they think I just need to take this for the rest of my life. And it's like, no, let's just think about what you're doing here. You are asking the body, you're sending a signal to the body to do stuff. You're going to have to lay off and let it execute. And you can't just be pushing on the button over and over and over again. You're going to fry it. And I don't know that you are going to fry it, but really, why would you not just step back for a minute and see what unfolds for a period of time before you go back at it again?
Wanted to talk a little bit about people that are dealing with maybe chronic UTIs, interstitial cystitis. Have we found application of the bladder bioregulator in those types of conditions?
Yeah, I would say that the bladder might be helpful in interstitial cystitis, but if we think about what's driving UTIs is either a bacteria, like a bacterial imbalance, right? A urogenital system kind of microbiome imbalance. There's a hormonal component to it as well. Or can be so I don't see the bladder as being really central there. I would say for chronic UTIs, getting your hormones as a woman, if you're a woman, and you're anywhere near menopause, you're going to want to address your hormone status in some way, shape, or form. But also methylene blue is the champion when it comes to UTIs, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, the other thing I think that some people with interstitial cystitis are dealing with also is oxalates, and looking at the oxalate content either coming from the diet or from systemic fungal colonization as well.
Yeah.
Living in the age of COVID, so many people are dealing with myocarditis. different heart conditions. We're in the era of the virus with different respiratory issues. So do you think that the lung and heart bioregulators may have the potential to kind of prepare us for living in our modern world?
Yeah, I think they can't hurt, right? I think they can be helpful. I think we're better with them than without them. Are they going to solve all the problems? Heck no, unfortunately. But is it a good idea to keep them around and to use them judiciously, like in cycles, right? We talk about bioregulators over a certain age, you're going to want to do a certain number of cycles. And so maybe if you know that you've had an issue with the heart, whatever it may be, you may do more cycles every year of the heart bioregulator, with the blood vessel bioregulator. With the lungs, you might do the same thing. So lungs and blood vessel, and I would say cartilage. And cartilage also I often will throw cartilage in with heart, because I do think that collagen and elastin, that need for pliability and elasticity is a big deal for all these organs.
So many people dealing with various GI issues, intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut, SIBO, SIFO, all of those things. We touched briefly on the stomach bioregulator, but I'm wondering, does the stomach bioregulator have any influence on the small and large intestine, or do we need to be thinking elsewhere?
Yeah, I think for those things, especially for leaky gut or damage to the gut lining, we have to be thinking about things like BPC, lorazepam, KPV, GHK. We have to be thinking about short chain fatty acids to protect that mucus layer or to reestablish the mucus layer. We have to be watching levels of for example, Akkermansia. Like everybody went all cuckoo cocoa puffs when Akkermansia hit the market and pounding the Akkermansia. But guess what? We need some Akkermansia to be munching away at the mucus layer so that it renews. But if we have an overgrowth of Akkermansia, we're going to trash the mucus layer, and then we're no further ahead. It's, the bioregulator, I think for the stomach is the stomach. I don't know that it has this, it may have effect on the small intestine. I don't know the answer to that question. But I would say that when you're talking about gut permeability, you have much more direct heavy hitters coming out of the peptide space than even the bioregulators.
Many people have said that if a man lives long enough, he will likely develop prostate cancer. Many struggle with urination due to benign prostatic hyperplasia or inflammation of the prostate. Wondering how the prostate bioregulator might help those issues. And does it also potentially have the ability to reduce issues as we age?
Yeah. So I don't know about the prostate cancer piece. I would say that your pineal gland bioregulator, your thymus gland bioregulator, all of the things that keep the immune system healthy are going to be a better shot. There's also a synthetic bioregulator called Vilon, VILON, which is a very powerful immune bioregulator. Interestingly enough, I think it's part of the complex that is the thymus bioregulator because it's only available as a synthetic. So those would be more, I would say, on the prevention side, right? Or on the mitigating the risk side. The prostate bioregulator, what I've seen is I have seen men who were getting up to urinate multiple times a night, use that prostate bioregulator, and after 2 or 3 months, come back and say, wow, I don't have to get up as often. Or I'm a little reluctant in the world of, if your PSA numbers are high, you got to get that dealt with. But if the PSA numbers are just a little higher than you think, again, I've anecdotally from my community, I've seen men use the prostate bioregulator and see those numbers normalize. But I would say this is in the much lower, this is not in the red zone. This is maybe in the leaving the green zone into the yellow zone.
What might be the application of the muscle bioregulator? Many people listening may be dealing with fibromyalgia and issues in that realm. Does it have potential to kind of restore and regenerate muscle from that perspective? Is it helping more with muscle building? How would you think of the muscle bioregulator?
I would think of it in both those instances. I would probably pair it with the bone marrow, the cartilage, and the blood vessel, personally. I think. The bone marrow, I just like to throw it in every once in a while because honestly, again, it's another one of the ones that it gets left off to the side. People don't really know what to do with it. They don't pay that much attention to it. But I think the muscle in both instances, could be really interesting. In one of the books, they talk about elite athletes using the muscle bioregulator, I want to say with one of the immune bioregulators and a brain bioregulator, and getting really good response.
I wanted to kind of frame the conversation a little bit around chronic illness. So if we're talking about people that are dealing with mold toxicity, we're talking about chronic Lyme disease, we're talking about infections, would you think of using the peptide bioregulators early on, or is it better to address the tigers, so to speak, their infections, their environment, and then use the bioregulators maybe later in the process when they have addressed those issues and they're really working more on restoration and regeneration?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think even from a resource perspective and where you're going to put your attention, it's probably a good idea to even just get the tiger to stand down a little bit. Even if the tiger's not completely out of the room, because that can be a really long process. I personally would not throw bioregulators into a crisis situation, right? I would probably wait until, get out of the moldy environment and try to get the immune system. There's another bioregulator, which is a thymus bioregulator. It's actually a different version of the thymus bioregulator called Thymalin, Thymalin. The only place I know to get it, that I know for sure I'm getting Thymalin, is Cosmic Nootropics. And it is a box with scary Russian writing, by the way. Most of the Thymalin that you'll find with the research labs is actually Thymulin, which is a different compound. Thymalin is a tough one to produce. And I have Thymalin in my freezer at all times, because if I think that I'm coming down with something, I whip that stuff out. And if I jump on it fast enough, it is remarkable. So Thymalin might be one of the few bioregulators I would say might be helpful, but the people you're talking about most likely wouldn't be able to tolerate a full vial like I will shoot when I'm coming down with something, but they might be able to test like a microdosing thing to see what happens when I use Thymalin. Could it help to be part of the package that helps to bring the tiger under control, right? Along with things like KPV and whatever.
So I want to have a little bit of a conversation around how we would dose these peptide bioregulators. I personally have been doing them 30 days, 20-day break, 10 days, 20-day break, 10 days, that kind of a pattern. So wondering if that is what you generally recommend. You kind of hinted at we don't want to keep the gas pedal or the buttons being pushed all the time, that we want to have some breaks. So if we do take a break, like maybe the 20-day break after month 1, is there still some effect of these peptide bioregulators in those organs, glands, or tissues during that 20 days, that system is still continuing to heal? Or are we really then only getting that pedal or button pushing again once we go back on that bioregulator?
So if we believe that what the peptide bioregulator is doing is healing or repairing the DNA's ability to function as it did, then what we should be seeing is lasting improvement, right? It's not going to be indefinite necessarily, right? Because we still have the whole world to deal with and aging and all that stuff. But I think that after a period of time, when you stop, the results should hold. Now, are they going to slide after 6 months or 3 months or 2 months or 4 months, depending on the person? Probably. So if it's something that you feel, like, for example, the prostate bioregulator, if you were to start with like a 30-day run of prostate and blood vessel, and then maybe you throw testes in there as well too. And then you did your 30 days and you're a guy that is getting up like 3 or 4 times a night to go to the bathroom. And after 30 days, you're like, oh, it seems like maybe now I'm 2 to 3 times a night. It could be like more subtle. And so then you decide, okay, I'm going to take 20 days off. I'm going to do 10 days. I'm going to do that for 2 or 3 months and observe if I keep improving. And so it's a lot of art, this science, right? It's a lot of checking in with yourself and seeing, is this moving the needle for me?
And is that strategy of starting with a full 30 days and then doing 10 days towards the end of each month for several more months, is that a common way that you like to implement these, or are there other ways that maybe are more commonly used?
I think when there's a specific imbalance, that's a really good way to start. I think when you're dealing with someone who's basically, I get people who come and like, I have no issues, but I want to start using bioregulators because, I want to keep the tread on my tires healthy kind of thing. Then you might not start with 30 days. You might just move into your 10-day cycles right away and just keep cycling through.
So more the biohacker community potentially that doesn't already have something that they're trying to really heal from.
Yeah.
Do we find that taking them at any particular time of day is better, empty stomach better? Any other things we should know about how to optimize these bioregulators?
I like people to take them in the morning, just in case, right? Some people will find the pineal gland bioregulator in particular very stimulating. So sometimes at night it's too much. So I prefer morning time if possible, maybe noon. And again, depending on who you talk to, oh, with food is fine. No, always away from food. Out of my personal opinion, based on what I've learned and gleaned and read and whatnot, is 30 minutes before food is probably good enough.
I've been taking mine at noon, but now I'll be taking them in the morning, I think.
Well, I mean, look, if you're feeling good and you're taking them at noon, that's fine. I mean, but the challenge is that we have 750 supplements and 38 of them need to be taken on an empty stomach. Okay, this is a problem.
It is for sure. I know we'll have to compare pill boxes someday.
Oh God, no.
So you suggested that these peptide bioregulators are well tolerated in the majority of people. Are there any side effects that we should watch for? Could some people have a Herxheimer reaction, a detox reaction where maybe they feel worse for a period of time? Are there any contraindications, maybe pregnancy, nursing, or other conditions? And can we take these with any other supplement or medication, or there may be some combinations that we need to be careful about?
Yeah. So from a pregnancy and nursing perspective, I don't know. Look, they use them on kids in Russia, but do we have research and studies that say that it's okay? I haven't seen anything. So by me as a woman, I feel that once I'm growing a child, my body is no longer just my own. So I'm going to probably suspend this stuff until I'm on the other side of it. And that goes for when I'm nursing, just out of an overabundance of caution, right? If I think about it logically, I'm like, there should be no reason not to, but I don't pretend to know enough to say, oh yeah, sure, no problem, they're fine. I wouldn't do that. I think I'd be cautious personally. And there might be people out there with a different opinion, which is A-okay, right? In terms of working with other supplements, I've yet to see a negative interaction. And like I mentioned earlier, they're researched in conjunction with medications, drugs, and other supplements. So it really shouldn't be an issue, because think about it also that they work through a completely different mechanism of action. So there shouldn't be really any major overlap. In terms of side effects, I would be able to count on one hand the number of people over the last 4 or 5 years since I've started really working with them that believe that they've had some kind of a reaction, and they would be the most sensitive of the sensitive, the most reactive, the people who've got the most complex things going on. And in that case, it's not that I don't believe them. It's just that I think they have so many different things going on. It's hard to know what's driving what. But if they believe that they're having a reaction to them, I'm not going to tell them they're not. So I'm going to tell them to bail out. And if they choose to come back, we're going to come back at a much lower dose, much more slowly, to see how they do.
And that is a large percentage of people that are listening to our conversation that kind of fall into that.
Listen to your body. Yeah. Like, listen, you are your own best doctor, and I'm not a doctor of anything. So at some level, you have to know yourself. And if you're worried, then start small, start low and slow.
We talked earlier about the fact that these peptide bioregulators are endogenously produced in the body. So is it that as we get older, we just produce less? Or is it that as we get older, we have more things that need to be repaired and restored, and thus we just don't have enough supply for the demand?
I don't know. I think maybe it might be a little bit of both.
And do we think there's any feedback loop with these peptide bioregulators where our endogenous production potentially goes down if we're using an exogenous peptide bioregulator?
Yeah, I've never seen anything that would even imply that. So as far as I know, I would say no. I haven't seen that. It's not like growth hormone, right? If you take exogenous growth hormone, you completely throw your body out of whack and it's going to stop making its own. And that would be at the higher levels, obviously, but still, I don't think I've seen anything that implies that at all.
You mentioned earlier that the original Cavinson bioregulators that are available now, that there's 21 of those. I've heard Dr. Holtorf recently talking about other combinations. You mentioned one with ThyroPep, so thyroid axis bioregulator. He's kind of hinted at a mitochondrial bioregulator, a stem cell bioregulator. People listening, Dr. Holtorf was just on Nat's podcast recently, and I would urge you to go take a look at that. But wondering if you can just kind of give us some insight into how you see the future of peptide bioregulators.
Well, I think Kent Holtorf is a really interesting man, right? I mean, I think he's really deep into this. He's working very hard to isolate and identify the other small peptide chains that could be active. And I think that what they did is they went and looked at the thyroid and started to look at these 2 to 4 amino acid chains to see what's active. Because there is, like I said, until ThyroPep here, we don't have a synthetic thyroid bioregulator. And I'm not sure. Well, he's got glandular in here, bioregulator complex T4, T3, naturally occurring acetylated. So, this bottle implies that this is natural bioregulator. But what he's done is that he's identified different sequences that are active. So I think that the future of bioregulators is people like him standing on the shoulders of that one giant of Professor Cavinson and continuing his work and his research. Right. And just not saying, OK, I love what you've done. Now, what else is there? What else can we find? What are the other things that are playing a role here? And I think that, the guys over at Nature's Marvels are really interesting because, like I said, they had to go do a deep dive and identify exactly what was in every single one of those bioregulators that they were producing. So they're probably sitting with a treasure trove of information as well.
I want to spend a few minutes just kind of bringing attention to some of the amazing resources that you have so that people can get more connected to you. Your podcast is amazing. I've been listening to a lot of them the past few months. I know you have some courses as well. You have an online community. And yes, for people listening, I have signed up, and it's really nice to be able to have conversation with people that are using some of these tools and really understand their experiences. So what are some of the ways that people can benefit from you and your resources and continue exploring peptide bioregulators?
Thank you. So you've already talked about the podcast. So that's Longevity with Nathalie Niddam. I'm ill-advisedly overhauling my website and my community at the same time. So the best way to keep track of the bouncing ball is to sign up for my newsletter, which is on my website at natniddam.com. And that way I have a way of telling you what's happening when, and would welcome you guys into the community. Now, we do have a peptide course, it's not a huge course, but it talks about the 13 main peptides. And I've got this itch to start adding to it right now. So we'll probably start adding some peptides to that course. I've been threatening to do some kind of a bioregulator course for the longest time. I've probably got about 5 or 6 deep dives done already. So again, it's just a question of capacity for me to start releasing that. But all of these things will get released in the community before it gets released to the outside world.
And it's really nice because in the community, you have live Q&A sessions with the members of your community. And so you make yourself much more available to people that want to learn from you and your experience. So people that are interested in this realm, I definitely would encourage you to check that out. It's kind of funny listening to some of your podcasts and hearing the person you're interviewing calling you Nathalie throughout the entire podcast.
I know, and I don't have
is silent.
A heart to correct them, because by the time they get started, I'm like, oh.
My last question is the same for every guest, and I'm guessing it's a long list for you, but what are some of the key things that you do on a daily basis in support of your own health?
So I try to get into my sauna, my infrared sauna, as many times a week as I can. I get to the gym at 7 a.m., sometimes a little earlier, probably 4 or 5 days a week. I've got this funky new little light that helps my body to make its own vitamin D3. And then I have this, and I'm mentioning gizmos because some of these devices have changed my routines.
Like mention away. I've got them going on both arms.
I use the Soltec. I was introduced to Soltec last fall, and I'm finding it to be a remarkable device. And so I do every night before I go to sleep with a relaxation program. And this morning I couldn't get myself to go to the gym. And so I did a half-hour relaxation program with the Soltec. So I don't meditate per se, but I'm definitely moving into this space of spending more time on the mindfulness piece and just finding some quiet time for myself. I use my Katsu bands every day. I jump on a vibration plate every single day. There's things that I just like, they've become non-negotiables. And so then it makes it really hard because I travel a lot and I can't schlep all my stuff with me. So I'm yelling at all my people saying to Soltec, like, guys, you need to chop. You need a travel version here that doesn't weigh like 30 pounds or whatever this thing weighs. So, I get outside every day. I mean, I made it easier by the fact that I have an old dog and she insists on getting outside about 10 times a day, even for a short time. So, so it's about keeping my body moving and keeping my mind balanced. And then there's the little egg cup of supplements that pops in every once in a while.
Which I'm guessing is not for the entire day, right? That's just one serving.
That's just part of the stack. But I actually got introduced to this company where I get my foundations, like my foundation, not fancy stuff. I have 7 capsules that I take a day that has all my foundations in it. And it would have been like a whole other collection of bottles. So these are the fancy things. And, and then the foundations are in there. And then they're, And
are the foundations kind of personalized then to you based on your genetics or micronutrient deficiencies?
Yeah, exactly. It's based on I don't love supplementing based on genetics other than looking at genetics to say, oh, well, this pathway is not optimized, so I better be taking my Bs in a methylated form kind of thing, right? But I don't believe in using genetics in that sense. It's more, we did some testing and it's like, oh, you're a little low here and you could probably use some of this and you need a bit more of that. So this is like, this is a 3-month supply and then we'll retest and then see if we've moved the needle on stuff. So, which is why I'm back to using that Metabolic because it's wintertime here. And instead of taking D3, which we know maybe it might be a little problematic, that maybe if I let my body make it itself, that'll be more effective. So off we go.
So do check out Nat's podcast. She often has discounts and other things on a lot of these great tools that she's talking about. I just want to thank you for your generosity of time, but also for everything that you're doing to support those of us that are really looking for richness in health. It's empowering to know that we have a lot of these tools in the toolbox that we can explore these days. I think we all want to live long, healthy lives. And I really want to honor you for your really profound and significant role in helping us to do exactly that. So thanks so much for being here, Nat.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure and a pleasure to meet you.
You as well. To learn more about today's guest, visit natniddam.com. That's Nat, N-A-T, Niddam, Niddam.com, natniddam.com. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a positive rating or review, as doing so will help the show reach a broader audience. To support the show, visit betterhealthguy.com/donate. To get my newsletter, visit betterhealthguy.com/newsletters. To follow me on Facebook, Instagram, X, or TikTok, you can find me there as Better Health Guy. This and other episodes can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, and Odyssey.
Thanks for listening to this Better Health Guy blogcast with Scott, your Better Health Guy. To check out additional shows and learn more about Scott's personal journey to better health, please visit betterhealthguy.com.